It is time to return our attention to Formula One. We're in Mexico this weekend. 5 races before the end of the season over the course of 6 weeks, and it is an absolute titanic struggle between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. Delighted to welcome Rebecca Clancy of the Times and the Sunday Times to the show. Rebecca, good morning.
Good morning.
I was reading your piece yesterday from the United States, chatting about Texas and the real interest in this thing over in the United States, that it had made so many attempts to crack the US in the past, but all of a sudden it's happened in explosive fashion this season.
Yeah, Austin is always a great race weekend. It's a brilliant city in itself, but it's always a really fun weekend. And this is my 5th season, and in the years that I've been to Austin, I've never seen anything like I've seen this year. Normally you go, it's always well attended, as sort of about 300,000 of a weekend, so it's always just shy of what we get at the British Grand Prix. But this year it was absolutely bonkers. There were people everywhere in F1 tops. I mean, right from McLaren, Mercedes to Haas. I saw people actually wearing T-shirts with just the F1 logo on. You couldn't, for love nor money, get a restaurant reservation at all. If you didn't have a reservation, you'd walk into a restaurant, they'd look at you like you were a bit, what are you doing here? And then you'd be told to wait up to 2 hours for a table. It was just impossible. And then if you were a bit like myself and not particularly organised and you were late booking a hotel room, it was almost impossible to get a hotel room. So, it was crazy. And they're saying that the numbers were 400,000. And normally when they put the numbers out, I'm a bit sceptical, but I could probably believe there were 400,000 there this weekend. I mean, the circuit is about 11 miles outside of the city. And as anyone who's been to the States will know, they're huge roads, so traffic isn't really an issue. You kind of keep moving. But the journey was taking easily an hour. Just right. So many cars going in. It was very well attended.
How do American Formula One fans differ from, say, the British Formula One fans? Is there a different sort of culture like we see in other sports?
I guess so. In America, they're all up for the whole show, whereas when the British fans come, they're very engaged, they're exceptionally knowledgeable, not to say American fans aren't, but they are just there purely for what happens on the track and all of the stuff that happens around that, the sort of fan zone that the new owners, Liberty Media, have set up, the concerts that they put on. They're not necessarily there for that, whereas when the American fans come, you know, in American sports, we see it with the NFL and in baseball, they're very much entire shows. And when Liberty took over, they said they wanted to create Super Bowls of every weekend. So big events, not just what happens on the track, but away from it. And the Americans have really got into that side of it. And so when they go for entire days. So, for example, the entire timing of what happens on the track in the States is all geared around what happens off the track. So I think it was 2018, there was a Taylor Swift concert in the evening on the Saturday of qualifying. But qualifying was at, I think, 2:00 and the concert was at sort of 7. And no one came to qualifying. And then the track was packed for Taylor Swift. Whereas now they've moved qualifying back, which is an absolute disaster for my print deadlines. But anyway, they've moved qualifying back to, I think it was at 5:00 this evening. So people go straight from qualifying into the concerts. And it was Billy Joel this year, so a brilliant concert. Everything is being geared around sort of the whole day rather than just as we get sort of in Europe, really, not just even the British Grand Prix, but it's much more focused on the track action.
So Taylor Swift in the crosshairs of Liberty Media and of the Formula One right now, it seems. Like that's a really interesting point you make about the businessmen that run Formula One and how they wanted to lean into the Americanization of sport. And like if you compare that to, say, even the Super League flirtation with football earlier in the year, there was this real sneeriness, rightly or wrongly, towards the perceived Americanization of football, and British football fans were really disgusted with those ideas as much as the grotesque capitalism. But is there a sense amongst even the traditional Formula One fans that this is all really good? It's great that we're leaning into this Americanization of the sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous market to tap. We have a population of more than 300 million, and most of them seem to be obsessed with sport. So why would you not want to try and tap into that region? I mean, Liberty have done very well. They've obviously got the race in Austin, which existed before then, but now they've brought in a semi-street race in Miami. There's quite a lot of rumours, and from what I understand, they're very strong talks are going on about Las Vegas. Apparently they met with the Las Vegas potential promoter at the weekend in Austin. And one of the stumbling blocks there is that they want to use the Strip, and the casinos, as you can probably imagine, aren't too keen on the footfall dropping potentially from having a race on the Strip. So they're looking at that. But with the Americanization, I suppose part of that is this introduction of sprint races that we've seen at 2 races so far this year. and we're having it again in Brazil. And actually, I was talking to Ross Brawn yesterday, who's the F1 motorsport director, and he was saying it's been a success. So the sprint race is, we have qualifying gets shifted to the Friday evening, then we have a sprint race, which is the third distance of the main race, and then that determines the starting grid of the race. And so there was a huge fan survey done this year, and avid fans, as they're called, or as F1 would call them, they didn't like the sprint race. They don't like the traditional format being tinkered with, and so they weren't that enamoured by it. And what a big problem also came with the fact that from qualifying is normally the pole position, whereas pole position now comes from whoever wins the sprint race, and actually the drivers don't like that either. So there's a lot of talk going on about that. But Ross Brawn was saying that basically the sprint race has been successful, and it was particularly successful for new fans. And what we're getting from America is a lot of new fans. And so, okay, we've got sort of millions, we're talking sort of 14, 15 million people watching races. And so it's really important to tap in to a larger group who, the younger audiences don't necessarily want to sit down and watch races for an hour and a half. So you have to give them something else. You have to keep adapting, evolve or die, as they say. So it's kind of looking at that. And that's the, Americanization of it, how you can make the weekend bigger. And it's all part of this Super Bowl of, normally. And I have to say, I am quite a bit of a fan of the concept of a sprint race, because Fridays traditionally are just practice, which is 2 60-minute sessions of the cars going round and round and round and round, which I appreciate is how some people feel about Formula One at the best of times. But it's not interesting. There's no, Friday doesn't really mean anything. So if you make the track action on Friday more interesting, then you do naturally get more people through the door. And as you can imagine, with there being 23 races next year, it's a record number. Apparently all 23 of those race promoters, the people who organise the races, have gone to F1 and said, we want the sprint race. So this idea of expanding weekends, of bigger parties, it does seem to be working.
Yeah, for sure, Rebecca, and I think you're right there. It's for the borderline Formula One fan. I think the sprint races are certainly a good thing. And I know the drivers seem to enjoy it as well. It makes the Friday a lot more interesting for the viewer. And if we discuss the on-track matters then from the Austin Grand Prix as well, and look, a very mature performance, you have to say. And I think Christian Horner used that word about Max Verstappen after the race, that there was a maturity level to his performance. That's an 8th win in 17 races for him. Hamilton's got 5 wins. We've got a couple of races coming up that maybe favour Red Bull. But looking back at that performance and the way Max handled the I guess the degradation on his tyres over that race, very, very mature performance from the young man.
It was absolutely brilliant, yeah. I spoke to Christian after the race, actually, and he said it was probably one of Max's best ever drives of his career, and I'd be inclined to agree. He was on pole for the race at a track which traditionally Mercedes and Hamilton have won at. Hamilton had won in the Circuit of the Americas 5 out of the 8 times that we had been there. So he was very dominant, and Max started on pole, but Lewis Hamilton came through and was leading at the first corner. Now, perhaps the Max Verstappen of old would lose his head a bit and, make a mistake or whatever. But he didn't. He was very calculated. He stayed within touching distance of Lewis Hamilton. And then Red Bull made a very, very aggressive strategy call. And they decided to bring Verstappen in very early, or what seemed to be very early. I think it was on the end of lap 12 of a 56-lap race. So that does it was always going to be a two-stopper because, as you mentioned, tyre degradation at this track is huge. It seemed very early, but basically what they were doing is what's called the undercut. So Verstappen had nowhere to go. He was always running in Hamilton's dirty air, and Red Bull decided to pull him in and then put him into some clean air, and then he puts in he's on fresh tyres, puts in some really fast laps, and then by the time Mercedes had reacted and pulled Lewis Hamilton in 2 laps later, Verstappen was leading the race, and he was leading by 6.5 seconds. So it was a huge call that paid off massively. And then he managed the stint really well. And I don't like to go on about tyres too much because they are one of the more boring sides of F1. But Lewis Hamilton really struggled on that first stint, which is also one of the reasons that Verstappen was able to open up such a big gap when he did that pit stop in those 2 laps. But then the second stint, or middle stint as it were, Verstappen was very good. He managed the tyres very well, as you said. And then Red Bull went again. And then Mercedes, they pitted, and Mercedes said to Lewis, right, we're going to have to go long. And then it didn't end up being that long because, as you said, the tyre degradation was so bad. So they pulled him in, and it looked like at that point, when Hamilton came out from his second stop, he was about 8 seconds behind. and he really needed to close the gap. And he kind of stuck around 8 seconds for a while, and then he just started hammering lap after lap after lap. And he got down with 5 laps to go with 1.5 seconds, within 1.5 seconds of Verstappen. And Max Verstappen looked in his rearview mirrors and clearly thought to himself, yes, okay, there may be a 7-time world champion all over the back of me, but I can do this. And he put in a couple of really quick laps just to get a bit more breathing space, and that was enough. And that really was enough to hold off Hamilton at a track at which he had completely dominated at before. And for a lot of us who are commentating on the sport this year, for us that was a really big moment in the championship. And if Verstappen does go on to win, that race in Austin will be quite a key moment. It wasn't just about Verstappen, who was a brilliant driver, but it was also Red Bull. They just out-strategized Mercedes completely. And it was fantastic to watch this battle, but Mercedes, Hamilton, they couldn't really respond to what Red Bull and Verstappen had done, and it was an exceptionally mature performance from both of them.
Yeah, exceptional performance for sure. I guess, Rebecca, if tyres are boring, one thing that's not boring is Martin Brundle's pit lane interviews and moments. For anyone who hasn't seen this particular moment with the rapper Megan Thee Stallion, I guess he tries to approach her and ask her to do a little off the cuff rap for the cameras. She kind of just looks at him and doesn't respond. One of her bodyguards or someone with her then says to Martin Brundle, it appears, you can't do this, you have to get away from us. And Martin's response is, I can do what I want because I just did. Interesting to see Martin's tweet. And look, these pit lanes, I know pit lanes are fairly manic at the best of times, but Martin's response on Twitter was quite considered. He said, I felt under pressure on the grid before, but by people called Senna, Prost, Schumacher, Mansell, Piquet and so on. Bodyguards visiting the grid for the first time don't bother me. Everyone's got a job to do, but they could maybe learn some manners and respect on our patch. And that's a fair point, I think, Rebecca.
Oh, absolutely fair. I have to say, Megan Thee Stallion, in her defence, swiped away her bodyguard very quickly. What I will say on this one is it's really interesting. So Rory McIlroy was there with Aston Martin, and I spoke to a couple of the teams about this afterwards, about behaviour and do you prep the celebrities before they go on, what's expected, because obviously Martin Brundle is a stalwart of Formula One and he's been doing these grid walks for a very, very long time. And most celebrities who come, they're actually repeat celebrities. So they expect to see Martin Brundle pop up with a microphone in their face at some point. But for me, yeah, absolutely, there's no place for rudeness, and that bodyguard shouldn't be manhandling anybody. And I'm sure you probably all saw on the memes with the Harry Potter lookalike who came through at the end, as you said. Or the character, I can't remember, I don't watch Harry Potter, but apparently look like one of them. But anyway, it's down to the teams
Draco Malfoy was
to brief the celebrity. To brief the celebrities and their security detail as to the procedure and the etiquette on the grid. But one thing I'll say is I'm not entirely sure why she even had her security on the grid, because it's almost impossible to get onto the grid. It is the most controlled area you've probably ever been to in sport. It is ridiculously difficult to get onto. And so there's not going to be any random people there. There's no one who's going to be going up to, apart from maybe Martin Brundle, for her, I suppose. She might not know who he is. But there's no one who can, there's no threat, as it were. So I'm not sure what her security detail were even doing on the grid. And I have to say, there are a lot of famous people. I say famous people, but I didn't know who they are, but I guess they're big in the States. And all you could actually see was their security detail. You couldn't even see them. And for me, with Formula One, with the celebrities get something out of going to a Formula One race. They get in front of a lot of eyeballs. It's good for their reputation. It's good for their exposure. And so part of that, it's a two-way deal. So they should really, part of it is to be doing these interviews. And that's what I mean when I say about the team's briefing, is that you should expect someone to come up to you and do a quick interview. And maybe it wasn't the best question, but, he doesn't know her. And it's just, he knew she was a rapper. So it's a bit of fun. And she took it quite well in her defense. The men around her, not so much. But I think the teams need to be briefing better on this one, because Martin Brundle, as we know, if there's a celebrity, he's going up to them and he's going to try and talk to them. And that's just the way it is. But there's absolutely, and there never will be, any place for rudeness.
Did Megan Thee Stallion enjoy her Formula One experience overall, do we know?
I've absolutely no idea. I presume so. I mean, she looked like she was... I am actually fortunate enough to be on the grid beforehand, and I cannot tell you the amount of times I've nearly had my head taken off by Martin Brundle's cameraman while I'm trying to duck out of shots. But because they're manic, it's absolutely manic. And actually, I have to say that grid was probably the busiest I've ever seen it. It certainly didn't feel like a time of COVID. But she looked like she was having a great time.
Yeah, Shaquille O'Neal, I think it looked like he was having a great time at the Grand Prix as well. Can I just ask you, Rebecca?
Shaquille O'Neal, apparently he was being interviewed by an American broadcaster, and I actually saw this happening. I was standing just to the side, and Shaquille O'Neal was having such a good time that the American broadcaster tried to walk off, and Shaquille O'Neal just grabbed him back and carried on talking.
Literally the first time that's ever happened to a journalist.
Yeah, exactly. Just having fun. Hey, Rebecca, can I just ask you about the really interesting comments in the last few days from Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team principal, and he's talking about this battle between Hamilton and Verstappen and how, look, if it goes down to the wire, we might have an incident where we've seen in years gone past with Schumacher and Villeneuve and famously with Senna and Prost as well, where I guess the person ahead on points tries to take out the other driver. I think Wolff's comments were, if it was to come to the scenario of the last race in Abu Dhabi and they were to be racing each other for the title, whoever is in front on points is absolutely going to try to do the same as in the Senna Prost years. Like, we've seen them come together a couple of times this year, famously at Monza. Like, that's a tantalising prospect that in the last race we could see a really, really juicy battle between the two.
Yeah, and there's very few people who don't expect it to go down to the last race in Abu Dhabi either. And as you said, there's been two fairly serious collisions this year, plenty of wheel-to-wheel, but two serious collisions, one in Silverstone and then, as you say, in Monza. And after that incident in Monza, actually, probably most of us expected there to be another incident. And there probably will be, because there's only 12 points between them. There's 5 races to go. As you mentioned at the start, the next 2 races tend to favour Red Bull, although this season, I don't even know where you put your money anymore, because, I mean, Russia and France were interesting this year, and that's never happened before. So it's one of those seasons where you just don't know. It was really interesting coming from someone like Toto, because obviously he's speaking to Lewis Hamilton, his driver, all the time. Lewis Hamilton, I will say, though, is not a dirty driver. He doesn't have a reputation for it. I'm not saying Max Verstappen is a dirty driver at all, but he does take a more aggressive stance, shall we say, when racing. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm right on deadline and they go into each other and I have to do a complete rewrite at all, because that's how it's been going. And, you know, these aren't, Max is only 24, but he's not inexperienced. This is his 7th season. As I've said, Lewis Hamilton, he's 36. He's in his 15th season. He's got 7 world championships to his name. Both are very experienced now, both in very different places in their career, both racing with different levels of experience. I wouldn't have thought Lewis Hamilton would go into Max Verstappen. He's not really that kind of driver. We did see in 2016, when he ended up losing the title to his teammate then, Nico Rosberg, he tried to back up the field because Nico at that time was running second. And that was enough for Nico Rosberg to win the championship. And Lewis Hamilton was winning. So he was trying to slow everything down and back it all up so that someone would overtake Nico Rosberg. It obviously didn't happen, but that's, you know, within the rules. So it will be interesting to see how this goes. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the metal tangles again and we get some big explosive fireworks that don't just come out of the grandstands. It will be very interesting to see. But they are both very respectful drivers, and they are both very acutely aware that any crash can be extremely serious. So I don't think it will be done too deliberately, shall we say.
The logic suggests that this weekend racing at altitude should suit Red Bull more than Mercedes, but this has been an unpredictable season. So before we let you go, Rebecca, how do you see this weekend going, and how do you see these next 5 races going?
Yeah, it has been unpredictable, as I said. I would say this race this weekend in Mexico is definitely Red Bull. I would be surprised if they didn't. They've got an even better package than they've had in previous years. So I would really be surprised if Max Verstappen and even Sergio Perez, if we don't see a 1-2, which they've not actually had this season. In fact, the only team who's had a 1-2 this season is McLaren. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them 1-2, which will be quite damaging for Hamilton and for Mercedes. Brazil, then we go to the next week. Again, I think that will be a Red Bull track. And then we get into the unknowns. We have Qatar and we have Saudi, 2 tracks we've never raced at before. Saudi has a really long straight, which would favour the Mercedes, which has a faster straight line speed, but can be a bit technical in sections. The same with Qatar, that's quite technical, so that would then favour Red Bull. And then we finish in Abu Dhabi, which has traditionally been a Mercedes track and a Hamilton track, but Max Verstappen there last year was absolutely amazing. He was on pole, he dominated the race, he dominated the entire weekend, really. So I have no idea.
I think you've done a pretty good job of whetting the appetite, though, for the next few weeks, Rebecca. A pleasure to chat to you. Thanks a million.
Thanks a million. Cheers.